On the night of February 27, 2014, unknown armed people took control of the Crimean parliamentary building. They hung out the flag of the Russian Federation. In the morning of the same day, people with weapons occupied the village of Chonhar in the Kherson Oblast. After a while, armored personnel carriers were riding across farm fields, and people in military uniforms without identification marks were planting mines at the approaches to the bridge leading to Crimea. You are watching the program about the ATO, the objective of which is to get to the bottom of such events as the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent anti-terrorist operation, or ATO, in the east of Ukraine. History is written by the winners, and usually they ditch the achievements of defeated opponents, extolling their own virtues. The ATO has been ongoing for more than 3 years, and hopefully the end of this senseless war is still out there on the horizon, though uncertain. This documentary series will cover the recent events in Ukraine and, most importantly, will try to explain the reasons behind these or other events. Throughout the Soviet era, Sevastopol, a one-of-a-kind base, was the home port of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. But in 1991, Crimea slipped out of Moscow's control together with Ukraine. Russia, however, as the inheritor state of the USSR, could not abandon the Russian Black Sea Fleet as leverage against the US Navy in the Mediterranean Sea. The fleet division process lasted right up until 1997. According to the initial plan, the fleet of the Russian Federation was to be redeployed to the Novorossiysk base, but the construction of this base had to be completed and it had to be expanded. Up until that time, the Crimean bases would have to be leased out. However, the first border conflict occurred as early as 2003. It was kind of a dummy rehearsal of an invasion. The Russian leadership at the time ordered the construction of a dam stretching from the Taman Peninsula to the Portland Tuzla Island. The builders operated on a 3-shift basis, and the earthwork grew 150 meters a day. After the dam reached the border pontoon near the island, the Ukrainian Marines landed on Tuzla. On the shore, the position of rocket artillery was organized, a powerful line of ammunition was set up, and a minor war for the Tuzla Island, which is approximately 3 square kilometers in area, was literally on the horizon. In 2007, there was a second rehearsal. The Marines of the Russian Federation landed on the Kerch Peninsula without any consent of Ukraine. The battalion of the Marine Corps made its way from the base in Tembruk and made a landing at Cape Opak. The Ukrainian command reacted promptly, deploying paratroopers of the 79th and 25th Brigades, which had strong support of the Ukrainian Air Force. The paratroopers occupied the key heights, thus blocking the movement of the Russian forces and forcing them to return to the base. In other words, it is important to bear in mind that the confrontation in Crimea is an age-old story. Pro-Russian propaganda was constantly disseminated among the local Crimean residents. Political spin doctors were fanning the flames in pursuit of additional votes in the elections. They made constant attempts to highlight Russian-speaking people. And while throughout Ukraine people were stirred up by canvassing in the Ukrainian language, in Crimea pro-Russian political forces were feverishly putting up billboards in the Russian language. A special operation on the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula began on February 20, 2014. Later, the Russian Federation issued a medal for the return of Crimea. Already on February 23, in Sevastopol, a mass rally of thousands of people was held, during which a decision was made that taxes to the official administration in Kiev would not be paid, and Russian citizen Oleg Chali was elected the mayor of the Ukrainian city of Sevastopol. On February 25, a similar rally was held in Simferopol. But let us pause here for a minute and consider one critically important nuance. On the night of February 26, 2014, Russia put skin in the game. Men wearing Russian military uniforms without insignias and mounting Russian military hardware without serial numbers suddenly appeared on the entire territory of the Crimean Peninsula. They took control of the Simferopol airport, the Belbek military airfield, and then the Kerch ferry crossing. That is, from the very start of the operation, the Crimean Peninsula turned into an island, to which Russian military personnel without insignias, the so-called Little Green Men, had direct access. To understand the origins of the polite people, we have to look back in time once again. In 2009, the Russian Federation started to establish the SOF, short for Special Operation Forces. The Special Operation Forces are highly trained troops designated to achieve political and economic objectives at any geographical point around the world that represent the interests in the name of the Russian Federation. The Russian media sarcastically call these people troops fighting a war in times of peace. Roughly speaking, while creating internal problems, the SOF distract citizens from external problems, destabilizing the situation, stirring up public opinion and discord, provoking unrest or even rebellion, eliminating disagreeable persons under the veil of common robbery or kidnapping them under the masquerade of terrorists. All these are the deliberately planned functions of the SOF. Moreover, some missions can be accomplished through third parties simply by handing weapons over the gangsters or mobs of people dissatisfied with the state's policy. Such people can be found in any country in the world, and under the tutelage of a highly trained leader and with external funding, these individuals can represent a very powerful force to be reckoned with. The creation and training of a guerrilla movement is also within the competence of the Special Operations Forces. The Russian SOF started working beforehand. The communication lines were broken, and the majority of Ukrainian military commanders in Crimea were either bribed or turned into Russian moles. In short, they opened their gates without a fight. Those who did not surrender were put in isolation and did not receive any orders from the top brass. Without an official declaration of a war, the Ukrainian armed forces became prisoners of the situation. Hamstrung by the laws of peacetime, the Ukrainian military soldiers did not have the right to use weapons against an aggressive pro-Russian throng of rabid and emotionally pumped-up demonstrators. As early as November 2013, the accumulation of fuel and other resources began at Russian military bases in Crimea. For example, the amount of aviation kerosene alone that was delivered in cisterns was 3 times more than usual, 45 cisterns instead of 12. Given this fact alone, it is not surprising that the Russian Federation's army was able to promptly block or take control of all the military towns and Ukrainian bases in Crimea within just a few days. But why was there treachery? What exactly prompted many Ukrainian soldiers to betray their homeland? It's quite simple. Through the efforts of the pro-Russian leadership of the country, the army has been destroyed systematically and at length. A Ukrainian military service person was paid several times less than their Russian counterparts who were living together with them. It just so happened that the salary of a Ukrainian military service person was slightly more than $150. Funding from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine was at a very low level, and military personnel faced constant problems with fuel supply and spare parts. On March 1, President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, asked the Federation Council for permission to apply the military forces of Russian troops on the territory of Ukraine and was given the green light for his green man. This was more of a diplomatic step and an act of intimidation, since Russian special forces were already de facto stationed and operating in Crimea. Military towns whose commanders did not want to defect to the Russian Federation were taken by assault. Ukrainian military were not always sitting on their heels. For example, on March 3, several planes and helicopters of the 10th Marine Aviation Brigade took off from the Novofedorivka airfield, which came as quiet and unexpected for the Russian forces. Thanks to the fog, they flew in the direction of Mykolaiv at an extremely low altitude. They flew very low so that the Russians could not detect and intercept them, and they also maintained strict radio silence. On March 4, Russian President Putin made an interesting statement at a press conference, the essence of which will be revealed in the near future. Listen to me attentively. I want you to correctly understand me. If we make such a decision, it will only be for the defense of Ukrainian citizens. Let anyone from the military service personnel even dare to try and shoot at their own people, whom we will stand behind, and not in front, but from behind. All over the place, the Russians use their so-called People's Local Defense Strategy. It entailed restless and riled-up youth, either unarmed or armed with billy clubs, behaving aggressively and trying to provoke Ukrainian military into using their weapons against them. This would have led the Russians off the leash. As it turned out later, often these were military servicemen dressed in civilian clothing, or simply provocateurs prepared specially to steer gapers. In some cases, this ended up in fisticuffs on the streets. On March 5, a man arrived at the location of the 36th Coast Guard Brigade, who introduced himself as an officer of the Russian Black Sea Naval Fleet. Subsequently, the paratroopers established that he was the commander of the 31st Separate Assault Brigade from the city of Ulyanovsk. During the meeting, he stated in the form of an ultimatum that all units, including the Reconnaissance Airborne Company of the 25th Brigade, which had been training since February 14, must turn in all of its firearms to weapon storage warehouses and put their military equipment in storage depots. At the command of a Russian general of the air cavalry, intelligence service scouts answered with a harsh no and threatened to use weapons in case of an unsanctioned breach and infiltration of the territory. A few hours later, a Ukrainian military unit wearing unknown and unrecognizable insignias on their uniforms was surrounded by unidentified military soldiers who organized machine gun and sniper nests. Immediately after the takeover of the government building of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, local deputies, while in the company of armed people, decided to hold on May 25 a national referendum in Crimea on the independence of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Already on March 6, the date and the wording were changed. The referendum was postponed until March 16, and the accession of Crimea to the Russian Federation was already on the agenda. Even before the referendum, on March 7, the Speaker of the Federation Council of Russia, Matviyenko, announced Russia's readiness to accept Crimea. In short, the annexation of Crimea was already a done deal. On March 9, the Ukrainian military put up their checkpoint on the Chonhar Peninsula from the direction of the Kherson Oblast. The Russians, while holding part of the peninsula, moved away from the village of Chonhar. Noteworthy is that the occupation of part of the Kherson Oblast was conducted more out of necessity, as from the direction of Crimea there was basically nowhere to settle and there was no electricity or amenities. On March 11, the Verkhovna Rada of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea adopted the Declaration of Independence. The idea of this document was that Crimea should become an independent state and in this form join the Russian Federation. All this time, throughout the entire peninsula, the seizure of military units and towns continued. At the mouth of the Donuslav Bay, the Russian Black Sea Fleet scuttled several ships, thus blocking the Ukrainian ships that were anchored from sailing out of the bay. Attempts of the minesweeper Cherkasy to break into the open sea were prevented in a severe way by the ships of the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
Я наказ на відкриття вогню віддавав.
I gave the order to open fire. Therefore, we still resisted when everyone stopped. My ship was the last one. When all the ships and ground units were captured, the Marines and Special Forces, when everything was seized, the ships maneuvered in the lake under the Ukrainian flag. Why did this happen? Because I gave instructions to fire off warning shots. It was a deterrent fire, not fire for the effect. This was enough for the special units of the Russian Federation to abandon its further actions. This gave us the opportunity to resist longer. Yes, we opened fire. We threw grenades and we fired small arms. We gave a warning shot along the course. Then we fired off several more warning shots ahead of our course. I take personal responsibility for it, because I did not want to leave that place in disgrace. Due to a combination of luck, the flagship of the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet, the frigate Hetman Sagaidachny, was at sea, despite the statements of the Russian mass media that the Ukrainian sailors had defected to the Russian Federation. The crew remained true to its oath to the Constitution of Ukraine and returned to Odessa. Not surprisingly, most of the population simply did not understand what was happening. Ukraine was just beginning to recover after the events on the Maidan. Due to the flight of the president and many officials, the branches of power were formed again, many state secrets were stolen and documents were lost. The savings in the national treasury amounted to 108,133 hryvnias and 65 kopecks, which at the exchange rate as of February 27, 2014 was about $10,000. According to various estimates, the former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, pocketed from $20 to $100 billion from the Ukrainian treasury. The process of returning this money continues to this day. On March 16, 2014, a referendum was nominally held on the accession of Crimea to the Russian Federation. After this day, Russian decorations appeared on the green map. As for February 27, now it's the Russian Special Operation Forces Day.